When Donald Trump raised U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods to 35% on August 1, 2025, he thought it was his power move, the moment he would bring Canada to its knees. He wanted to prove that America still controlled the game, that no neighbor could defy him, and that his economic nationalism could crush any resistance. But within weeks, that plan backfired hard. What was meant to humiliate Canada ended up uniting it. What was supposed to weaken Mark Carney turned him into one of the most admired leaders in the Western world. Trump's America First crusade suddenly exposed America's biggest weakness, its dependence on the very allies it was trying to bully. Canadian factories adapted, businesses rallied, and consumers launched a boycott that flipped the economic tables faster than anyone imagined. And through it all, Mark Carney didn't rage, threaten, or retaliate blindly. He stayed calm, surgical, and strategic, proving that real power doesn't come from shouting, it comes from outsmarting. This is the story of how 135% tariff, meant to punish, became the spark that reshaped North America's balance of power. You're watching Northern Pulse, and this is how Trump's gamble blew up in his face. It all started months earlier, when Trump returned to office and declared an unexpected national emergency, not over a war or pandemic, but over illegal activity at the northern border. He accused Canada of failing to control fentanyl trafficking and migration, even though his own agencies confirmed that less than 1% of fentanyl entering the U.S. came through Canada. But truth never mattered much in Trump's political theater. He used the emergency powers of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to slap a 25% tariff on Canadian imports, a shock that rattled markets and angered manufacturers across both countries. Then came August 1st. Trump raised it to 35%, calling it a corrective measure to restore fairness. Behind the scenes, officials whispered the real reason: Carney's plan to recognize a Palestinian state had infuriated the White House. The tariff wasn't about border control, it was punishment for political independence. But Trump overplayed his hand. Instead of fear, Canada responded with fire. Businesses stood behind Carney. Provinces that rarely agreed on anything spoke with one voice. Trump believed he was starting a trade war, but what he really started was a national awakening north of the border. And that awakening would soon turn Mark Carney into something Trump never expected: his most formidable rival. When Trump raised tariffs to 35%, the world expected outrage. But instead of fire and fury, Canada's new Prime Minister Mark Carney gave them something far more dangerous: discipline. While Trump shouted about unfair borders and Canadian freeloaders, Carney stood before Parliament like a man who'd already solved the puzzle. His words weren't loud, they were measured. He didn't attack, he explained. He didn't posture, he exposed. Carney calmly laid out the truth that stunned even U.S. analysts. 85% of Canadian exports were already protected under the USMCA agreement. The tariff, despite its noise, only touched a sliver of the economy. In other words, Trump's so-called economic hammer was a plastic toy. Then Carney did something even more brilliant. He thanked the U.S. for revealing how dependent it was on Canadian trade. He pointed out that the U.S. imported more steel, aluminum, and auto parts from Canada than any other country on Earth. He reminded everyone that America's strength and Canada's stability had always been intertwined, and that Trump had just taken a saw to his own foundation. Instead of matching Trump's theatrics, Carney turned the chaos into calculation. Behind the scenes, he quietly redirected investments into domestic manufacturing, clean energy, and Asian trade routes, building Canada's next economic chapter before the current one even ended. He didn't just neutralize the crisis, he absorbed it. Every tariff, every insult, every threat became fuel for his long game, turning economic dependency into national independence. Trump was busy performing for cameras. Carney was preparing for history. And that calm, unshakable composure would soon turn into the greatest political counterattack North America had ever seen. Carney knew that leadership isn't about reacting, it's about redirecting. And when Trump tried to choke Canada's economy, Carney didn't just retaliate, he rewired the nation's identity. Within days of the 35% tariff announcement, Ottawa unveiled a $155 billion retaliatory plan, targeting American goods from cars to cosmetics. But the real move wasn't economic, it was psychological. Carney was rallying the country around something bigger than trade: pride. From Vancouver to Halifax, a new slogan swept across the nation: Buy Canadian. It wasn't a government campaign. It was a grassroots uprising. Grocery stores started labeling local products with pride. Restaurants replaced American beef with Alberta's finest. Maple syrup outsold Coca-Cola. Even tourism flipped. Canadians canceled Florida trips and booked vacations in Nova Scotia and Banff instead. The message was loud and simple: we don't need America to define us. Carney supercharged the momentum with real support, expanding low-interest business loans, funding small manufacturers, and launching a $370 million biofuel initiative to boost agriculture and seafood exports. He told Canadians, "We're not retreating from globalization, we're rewriting our role in it." And just like that, the crisis became a movement. A country once seen as America's polite neighbor was now flexing its economic independence with pride. The world saw tariffs, but Canadians saw transformation. In the ashes of Trump's economic war, Carney had ignited something far more powerful than profit, a sense of purpose. And as this new nationalism surged, it wasn't just about buying local products. It was about believing that Canada could stand alone, stronger than ever. But Carney wasn't done. He was about to turn that public pride into political power. By spring 2025, the mood in Canada had shifted. What began as an economic standoff had turned into something deeper, a test of sovereignty. And Mark Carney, ever the strategist, knew exactly when to strike. He called a snap election, framing it not as a political contest, but as a fight for Canada's dignity. His message was razor-sharp. This isn't about tariffs, it's about who controls our destiny. At rallies across the country, Carney's calm tone carried more weight than any angry slogan. He stood before cheering crowds and declared, "There are some places that are never for sale. Canada is not for sale, and it never will be." That single line exploded across social media, radio, and television. Canadians printed it on shirts, painted it on signs, and even projected it on buildings. It wasn't just a quote, it was a declaration of identity. Carney's opponents tried to call him reckless. Trump mocked him on social media, but it didn't matter. Canadians weren't voting for safety anymore, they were voting for self-respect. When the ballots were counted, the result was a political earthquake. Carney's Liberal Party swept the elections, securing one of the strongest mandates in decades. The nation had spoken with one voice, "We will not be bullied." Trump had tried to divide Canada through pressure, but all he'd done was hand Carney a movement. And as Carney stepped back onto the stage that night, he wasn't just a prime minister anymore, he was a symbol. A leader forged in crisis, fueled by conviction, and ready to reshape the very relationship that had defined North America for a century. The election gave Mark Carney something no Canadian leader had held in decades, the political freedom to rewrite the rules. And while Trump kept boasting about his victory over Canada, Carney was quietly dismantling America's leverage piece by piece. His first move was philosophical, not financial. In a press briefing that went almost unnoticed in Washington, Carney said something historic. "The old relationship with the United States built on dependence and integration is over." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of evolution. Carney didn't want to break ties with America, he wanted to balance them. He began diversifying Canada's trade faster than anyone expected. Under the CETA agreement, European partners deepened energy and tech cooperation. Through CPTPP, Asian markets opened their doors wider to Canadian grain, beef, and lithium. Meanwhile, Carney quietly pushed for massive domestic investment, clean energy projects, electric vehicle plants, and mining expansions that would feed the world's green transition. He was building an economy designed to thrive even if America turned its back. Behind the scenes, his advisors called it the Independence Doctrine. It wasn't flashy or loud, but it was strategic, a plan to end the assumption that Canada's strength depended on proximity to Washington. The irony, Trump's aggression had done what decades of diplomacy couldn't. It united Canada behind a single purpose: sovereignty. By the end of 2025, Carney had turned America's trade war into a quiet revolution. Canada wasn't reacting anymore, it was repositioning. And the man once mocked by Trump as too polite to fight back was now redefining what quiet power really looked like. While Canada was rebuilding, the United States was quietly unraveling. Trump's 35% tariff, sold as a weapon of strength, had become a boomerang, one that hit home harder than anyone expected. American industries began to bleed, and the shockwaves reached deep into the very towns that had cheered for him. By late 2025, the lumber tariff had soared to 45%, set to hit 50% on January 1st. That meant Canadian wood was taxed higher than Russian imports, a stunning irony that even Trump's advisors couldn't defend. Construction costs in the U.S. skyrocketed, homebuilders froze projects, furniture prices jumped overnight. Then came the domino effect. Distilleries in Iowa and Virginia lost their Canadian buyers. Auto part suppliers in Michigan and Illinois cut staff as cross-border trade slowed. The tourism industry, a silent economic bridge between the two nations, collapsed. Canadians simply stopped coming. Hotels in Florida reported record cancellations. Las Vegas casinos saw their profits tumble. Even the Federal Reserve's Beige Book, normally dry and technical, noted the damage. Cross-border spending has materially declined due to prolonged tariff friction. And yet, Trump kept calling it a victory. He boasted about making America rich again as small businesses quietly shuttered and families paid the price. What began as a trade war had turned into an economic self-sabotage. The more Trump tried to look powerful, the weaker the U.S. economy became. And across the border, Carney watched not with arrogance but with understanding. He knew this was bigger than tariffs now. It was a test of endurance, one nation's ego versus another's resilience. And Carney's calm strategy was winning on every front. By October 2025, tensions were high, but Mark Carney wasn't finished. He wanted to face Trump directly, not to argue, but to outclass him. The meeting took place at the White House, an image Trump wanted to project as dominance. Cameras flashed as the two men shook hands, both smiling, both knowing this was more than diplomacy. It was psychological warfare. Trump started with his usual bravado, boasting about the tariffs, lecturing on America's strength, and dropping hints about making Canada part of the family. Carney didn't flinch. He listened, nodded politely, and smiled, the smile of someone who already knew how this conversation would end. He wore a red tie, matching Trump's signature color, a subtle power play that mirrored Trump's image right back at him. When Trump joked about annexation, Carney replied calmly, "Canada is family, yes, but we're the branch that learned how to stand tall." And when Trump complained about trade deficits, Carney reminded him, politely, that Canada had invested over $500 billion in the U.S. over the past 5 years. "If we pull back even a fraction," Carney said softly, "you'll feel it long before we do." The room went silent. Trump laughed it off. Cameras rolled again, but the power dynamic had shifted. Carney didn't win by arguing, he won by controlling the atmosphere, by leaving with dignity, not desperation. He had turned Trump's favorite battlefield, the spotlight, into his own chessboard. When the meeting ended, there were no deals, no concessions, just a quiet realization in Washington that the balance of respect had changed forever. Trump had met his match, and the world had just witnessed Carney's masterstroke. In the months that followed, the world began to realize something extraordinary. Canada hadn't just survived America's 35% tariff war, it had rewritten the global playbook on how to resist economic coercion. From Europe to Asia, policymakers were studying Mark Carney's quiet revolution. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't retaliated with rage. He had done something far more dangerous to U.S. dominance. He had endured. Carney's strategy became known among diplomats as the Canadian model, a mix of patience, preparation, and principle. He showed that a smaller nation could confront a superpower not by matching its volume, but by mastering its balance. In Berlin, economists praised Canada's economic diversification. In Tokyo, trade officials cited Carney's policies as proof that alliances could outlast intimidation. Even within the United States, analysts started whispering what Trump refused to admit, that Canada had just pulled off one of the most sophisticated geopolitical counterplays of the century. Trump's tariffs, once meant to isolate Canada, ended up isolating America itself. Allies grew cautious. Partners distanced themselves. And countries that once feared U.S. pressure now looked to Ottawa as an example of calm defiance. Carney's soft power had become a global force. His message to the world was clear: true strength isn't about control, it's about resilience. And that message resonated far beyond North America. Because what Carney had proven, quietly, methodically, and decisively, was that the future doesn't belong to the loudest leader. It belongs to the one who can stay calm when the world demands chaos. The U.S. had tried to teach Canada a lesson in power. Instead, Canada had taught the world one about leadership. Trump's 35% tariff was supposed to be the moment of dominance, the strike that proved America could still command its allies through raw power. But instead, it became the turning point that exposed how fragile that dominance had become. Because what began as an attempt to break Canada didn't just fail, it backfired on every level. It fractured U.S. industries, inflated prices, and alienated partners. It revealed that the same arrogance that once built American power was now eroding it from within. And on the other side of that chaos, Canada, the supposed victim, found its strength. Mark Carney didn't fight this war with anger. He fought it with composure. He didn't respond to Trump's noise with more noise. He answered it with strategy, stability, and quiet confidence. He turned tariffs into tools for nation building and economic pain into patriotic purpose. He gave Canadians something to believe in, not through slogans but through action. Trump's aggression built headlines. Carney's discipline built history. And as the dust settled, the lesson was undeniable. In a world where leaders shout to be heard, the one who stays calm will always outlast the storm. Canada had not only survived, it had evolved. It had become the model for how nations can stand tall without bowing to economic intimidation. Trump's 35% tariff didn't make America great again. It made Canada stronger than ever before. This wasn't just a trade war, it was a test of leadership. And in that test, Carney won not with bluster but with brilliance. You've been watching Northern Pulse, where power, policy, and pride collide.